The Committee on Digital Assets, Financial Technology, and Inclusion will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Crypto Crime in Context, Part 2, Examining Approaches to Combat Illicit Activity. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the Chair for inclusion in the record. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. After Hamas attacked Israel 4 months ago, some claimed that these terrorists were using crypto as a primary funding mechanism for their operations. Through hearings and confidential briefings, this committee has heard from the intelligence community, blockchain experts, and law enforcement, and we have a much better understanding of the scope and scale of crypto's role in terror finance. While the reactionary claims proved to be greatly exaggerated in the case of Hamas and Gaza, it's still important for us to identify and close any potential gaps that can be exploited by criminals and terrorists. Just yesterday, here in this room, Undersecretary Nelson testified that bad actors still prefer to use traditional finance rather than digital assets. He also confirmed prior reports that successful international collaboration with Israeli law enforcement had limited Hamas's use of digital assets ahead of the attack against Israel. Today, this committee seeks to understand the tools that law enforcement have to go after bad actors using crypto, as well as learn what, if any, gaps exist in those law enforcement authorities. Just last week, the Financial Times reported that Iran used 2 of the United Kingdom's largest banks to evade sanctions, which just goes to show again that terrorists will use any means necessary, cash or crypto, to accomplish their means. The fact remains that the transparency of a public blockchain provides law enforcement with critical data about illicit actors and their networks so that they can be gone after. Much of this success can be attributed to the partnerships between law enforcement and blockchain analytic firms. As bad actors become more proficient, regulators and law enforcement officials must continue increasing their own capabilities and expertise. But let's be clear, much of the illicit financing through digital assets doesn't take place here in the United States. It's done offshore in obviously non-compliant, rogue jurisdictions. The borderless nature of blockchain technology necessitates international cooperation. Today, we will examine what can be done to reinforce the set of tools that FinCEN, OFAC, and the Department of Justice possess. Members on both sides of the aisle are interested in finding solutions. This hearing, the legislation noticed, build off last year's efforts in both our stablecoin and market structure legislation. We must ensure that there's a functional regulatory framework in place so that digital asset companies operate within the United States and subject themselves to our laws. Last summer, this committee passed bipartisan legislation that would do just that. Today, we're fortunate to have an incredible lineup of witnesses to examine our current capabilities to hold bad actors accountable. I want to thank each of our panelists for being with us today. We appreciate your willingness to provide your expertise and your testimony. I look forward to continuing our work with my good ranking member, Mr. Lynch, the members of this subcommittee, so that we can use our time in search of solutions to combat illicit use of digital assets. With that, I'll yield back and yield 5 minutes to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you noted, first of all, I'd like to thank the panel. It really is a top-notch panel, and thank you for putting those folks together. In the aftermath, as you noted, in the aftermath of the attacks on October 7th, we received multiple classified briefings from the administration on the use of digital assets by terrorist groups, transnational criminal organizations, and rogue regimes. And while bad actors continue, as you noted, to rely on traditional financing methods to fund illicit activities, the concern that the crypto sector is vulnerable to terrorist financing and money laundering is certainly a valid one. In its recent risk assessment on illicit financing, Treasury reports that terrorist organizations and their material facilitators have markedly improved their experimentation with virtual assets. Criminal and malicious state actors have also expanded beyond the use of fiat currency and are now exploiting virtual assets to facilitate ransomware attacks, human and drug trafficking, and sanctions evasion. According to cybersecurity industry reports, global ransomware payments exceeded a record $1.1 billion in 2023, with criminals primarily demanding the delivery of extortion payments to digital wallet addresses. Similarly, the International Financial Action Task Force reports that Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS have all solicited funding through Bitcoin and privacy coins and other digital assets. They've also learned to leverage anonymity-enhancing services such as cryptocurrency tumblers and convertible currency mixers to obscure the origin and transfer of funds. Ironically, a primary reason that terrorist organizations do not rely on digital assets on a greater scale is actually their extreme volatility in value. The illicit financing risks relating to digital assets have also been exacerbated by the rapid evolution of artificial intelligence. According to the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, deep learning models could enable terrorists to propagate their fundraising activities with maximum efficiency and impact. Last week, Secretary Yellen testified here in Congress that Treasury has already identified critical gaps in its authority to deter illicit financial activities. Importantly, the department recently issued a detailed action plan to address the specific illicit financing risks associated with digital assets. Several priority recommendations, including the regulation of payment stablecoins and enhanced agency enforcement capabilities, will require bipartisan cooperation, congressional funding, and statutory authorization. FinCEN, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, has also taken important actions in this area. The agency recently proposed its rule to increase transparency in convertible virtual currency mixing and combat the use of anonymity-enhancing technologies by malicious actors, whether that is Hamas, drug cartels, or North Korea. In the interest of national security, I look forward to working with my colleagues on a bipartisan basis to further ensure that we are promoting the responsible innovation of cryptocurrency and other digital assets while mitigating their susceptibility to illicit financing activities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Today, we welcome the testimony of Carolyn Hill. Ms. Hill is the Senior Director of Global Policy and Regulatory Strategy at Circle. Michael Moser. Mr. Moser is co-founder and partner at Arcturus. Grant Rabin. Mr. Rabin is Director of Financial Crimes Legal Counsel at Coinbase. Ari Ridboard. Mr. Ridboard is Global Head of Policy and Government Affairs at TRM Labs. And Carolyn Noel House. Ms. House is Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and Executive in Residence at the TerraNet Ventures. Thank each of you for taking time to be with us. As I noted, each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral presentation, and your full written statements will be made part of our record. Ms. Hill, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Hill, Ranking Member Lynch, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I began my career investigating illicit networks for the UN and at OFAC, where I recommended sanctions actions against individuals and companies that were assisting the Iranians, North Koreans, and Syrians' attempts to fund their malign activities and access hard currency. I experienced firsthand the challenges of tracking illicit finance networks in the traditional financial space, particularly when involving foreign jurisdictions, as most cases did. I also saw the importance of a compliant private sector in being a partner to detect, freeze, and prevent these illicit flows. I then worked as the senior advisor to the US President of the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, and oversaw AML-CFT policy for the Treasury focused on Africa and Latin America. In these roles, I would frequently hear from developing countries that US financial institutions would cite AML regulations as the biggest challenge to facilitating banking services. A lack of banking services negatively affected cross-border payments, remittances, foreign direct investment, and other economic activity. At the same time, I could see that digital assets with proper regulatory clarity could overcome many of these challenges with the benefit of increased AML transparency. Digital assets brings nearly instant 24/7 settlement to the everyday consumer and serve as an important enhancement to today's traditional payment networks, which are typically restrictive, antiquated, and fragmented. The United States should be at the forefront of this technology in order to have a modern domestic payment system that is efficient, supports U.S. foreign economic power, and safeguards the integrity of our financial system. Circle is the sole issuer of the payment stablecoin USDC, and our track record of sanctions and Bank Secrecy Act compliance has exported stability, rule of law, and respect for U.S. AML-CFT standards to the broader digital assets market. Circle has established the same financial crimes compliance controls as expected with other financial institutions, and we have been able to leverage novel technologies due to the transparent nature of transactions on blockchains. This contrasts with transactions at traditional financial institutions, which are siloed to that specific bank. Anyone can view transactions on blockchains in real time, even when there's no US nexus. And Circle has worked domestically and with foreign governments to identify, trace, and deter illicit financial flows using USDC. And as a result of this increased transparency, we've also had the United Nations and the US government use or facilitate the use of USDC in Ukraine and Venezuela, respectively, to facilitate efficient and transparent payments across borders. The technology behind smart contracts also allows for the freezing of assets without delay on-chain, beyond the ability of traditional financial institutions with fiat. Anyone with an internet connection can see, for instance, the exact amount of USDC that has been frozen by Circle and sanctioned addresses. As such, payment stablecoin issuers should, without fail, be able to point to on-chain data to demonstrate compliance with sanctions laws. Unfortunately, the sector is not without rebuke. Some digital asset companies have a public track record of proclaiming themselves above AML-CFT regulation, even if issuing a US dollar-backed token. So why is it so important to get regulation of this sector right? The power of the US government's economic tools depends on the jurisdiction that Treasury has over US financial institutions, and by proxy, the US dollar and international payment services. As a result, many strategic competitors have been motivated to find alternative payment systems so they can be out of reach of US sanctions and law enforcement. The United States should have a whole-of-government effort approach to study these efforts and potential challenges to US dollar dominance. The US government should also strengthen the role of the US dollar in the future by supporting innovation that would make the dollar the base currency of digital assets. Regulated US dollar-denominated stablecoins import compliance and the rule of law to the digital asset space, so it is important to ensure that all US dollar-backed stablecoins have compliant BSA programs and adhere to OFAC sanctions. US Touchpoints should also be responsible when they are facilitating the existence of these non-compliant tokens. Furthermore, continued domestic enforcement of existing regulations is critical. Recent actions by the US government have demonstrated that digital assets companies are not out of reach. The US government should also continue to press other countries to adopt similar AML-CFT frameworks to ensure regulatory arbitrage is minimized. Finally, Congress should consider increasing funding for US law enforcement agencies to identify, track, and analyze financial crime networks. The US should also be the leader in training other countries in the technical know-how that has allowed US law enforcement to track and seize digital assets. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mosier, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak on topics to which I've dedicated most of my career: countering exploitation and supporting the democratization of opportunity. When I was Associate Director at OFAC, we not only created sanctions programs to defend national security, we created pathways for humanitarian aid and censorship-resistant technology like VPNs to support human rights activists under authoritarian regimes like Iran. When I was Acting Director of FinCEN, we launched a privacy tech program and created a senior digital identity role to focus on preventing victims, not just avenging after. I recently co-authored a paper on genuine DeFi as critical infrastructure, proposing a framework to improve our ability to prevent victims, leveraging public and private sectors and drawing upon government experience securing the integrity of financial infrastructure. The paper calls for greater involvement of Treasury through the Office of Cybersecurity and Critical Infrastructure Protection, or OSIP. OSIP works across law enforcement and financial infrastructure on threat detection and mitigation. Their touch point is an industry cybersecurity center called FS-ISAC, governed by its roughly 4,600 members. And importantly, membership is not limited by a financial institution definition, but rather your relevance to financial infrastructure and security. Much of this is already being built in the crypto sector, notably the Security Alliance and SEAL initiative, and a crypto ISAC information sharing center modeled on FS-ISAC. But OSIP's public sector intelligence coordination would meaningfully advance this work for everyone, including the government. Treating every gear of code in a technological network as a financial institution, collecting KYC on every data packet that is mathematically validated, overestimates the safety of financial institutions and the effectiveness of KYC. Major banks doing KYC have paid roughly $385 billion in penalties for illegal activity since 2000. KYC did not stop violent cartels from laundering nearly $900 million through HSBC. I can tell you as a former federal prosecutor who obtained the first BSA plea to hold a bank president responsible for soliciting Venezuelan black market peso dealers and walking them through KYC, the traditional finance system faces serious challenges. Over-reliance on static, easily duped KYC has created a voracious market for deep-fake, stolen, and exploited identities. This is failing the people we should be protecting and the public servants working to address illicit finance. Opaque international banking, from which the Bank Secrecy Act takes its name, prevents investigators from tracing global hops, making KYC limited help. The original anonymity-enhanced technology is cross-border fiat banking with nested accounts and shell companies. As every Treasury risk assessment has shown, nothing else can compete. This is less applicable in the on-chain world of traceable public ledgers where activity-based risk monitoring is globally accessible and harder to spoof than a fake ID. Law enforcement has followed Lazarus funds to cash out points and ultimately recovered over $30 million. To be effective, we have to recognize that blockchain networks are fundamentally cyber infrastructure, and we are better to capture the next Lazarus as an early cyber threat well before it makes its way all the way to a national emergency on an OFAC list or shows up in KYC. In addition to activating OSIP, a concrete action that you could take to fundamentally impact illicit finance is to resource existing Treasury authorities before adding more unfunded mandates. Throwing more shovels at people who already have 15 in each hand is not making them more effective, it's setting them up for failure. 4 years after the expansion of authorities in the AML Act of 2020, FinCEN still has not received the full funding to implement. Here are key items that we mapped out at FinCEN but have not been resourced by Congress to succeed. FinCEN's global FIU liaisons to leverage operational work directly with foreign FIUs in country. FinCEN's whistleblower office. People will stop sending tips if they don't see cases. Domestic liaisons were to be put in regions across the country, and an innovation officer to drive both internal and external innovation, all unfunded, all unfilled. Lastly, we separately had staffed a chief digital currency advisor who has not been backfilled since the last departure. If crypto is such a concern, fund the position and give the U.S. Financial Intelligence Unit a chance to succeed. My father grew up in a small mining and steel town and always said, all people want is opportunity. In a world of authoritarians who despise the unpredictability of distributed opportunity, our democracy was founded and thrives on enabling opportunity. That democratization and the natural, non-coerced alignment of people around principles is far more resilient for national security than a deputized and weaponized failing personal information collection apparatus, which is the Eastern Europe my father's ancestors were leaving. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Rabin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Hill, Ranking Member Lynch, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify today. My name is Grant Rabin, and I serve as the Director of Financial Crimes Legal at Coinbase, America's largest digital asset exchange. I lead the team of lawyers at Coinbase responsible for anti-money laundering, sanctions, and law enforcement matters. We work collaboratively with law enforcement to keep our platform and the broader crypto ecosystem safe. I have spent most of my professional life prosecuting financial crimes and stopping the bad guys from using technology to hurt Americans. I joined Coinbase after a decade as a federal prosecutor, in which I focused on the intersection of money laundering and cybercrime. While assigned to lead a suspicious activity report joint federal task force, I first saw reports coming in about Bitcoin-related transactions in 2013. I initiated some of the federal government's earliest criminal investigations into crypto-related money laundering, including partnering with FinCEN on one of its first crypto enforcement actions. I also organized and taught at some of the Department of Justice's first national trainings on crypto crime for prosecutors and federal agents. I am most proud of my work as a leader of the takedown of the world's largest dark web marketplace, Alphabay, which was described as the most successful cybercrime prosecution in the history of the internet, and for which I was given the Attorney General's Award, the FBI Director's Award, and the Director of National Intelligence's Meritorious Service Award. This case revealed the power of blockchain analytics in uncovering cyber criminals and involved the federal government's first ever seizures of Monero and Zcash. I came to Coinbase to continue this work. Coinbase is a company laser focused on being the most secure, trusted, and compliant platform in crypto. Our mission is to protect our customers, crypto, and the country. Just like me, hundreds of former national security and compliance professionals have joined the fight for the security of crypto in America. My career has shown me the breadth of tools Congress has given to law enforcement and how they can be applied to new technology and how to make crypto safer. As described in detail in my written testimony, there are 4 main points that I would like to leave you with today. First, there is a national security imperative to get this right. Keeping crypto here in America ensures compliance, enhances law enforcement, and secures the financial system. The reverse is true. If the pipes and plumbing of a technology that moves value flow elsewhere, the US government loses its ability to shape it. Second, Coinbase has invested heavily in its anti-money laundering program and global intelligence teams that partner with global law enforcement on a daily basis. We are constantly working to leverage new technology to establish a program that rivals any traditional financial institution. We have also led industry-wide anti-money laundering compliance initiatives. We take our obligation to protect Americans seriously. Third, sanctions evasion, terrorist financing, and criminal activity is concentrated with offshore platforms. Law enforcement should use all of the extensive legal tools at its disposal to police those offshore actors today. If additional funding is needed so law enforcement can prioritize crypto, Congress should provide it immediately. Fourth, Coinbase is supportive of legislation providing targeted additional tools that will make crypto a safer place. But it is important that Congress be thoughtful about its approach. As this committee knows, Coinbase is held to robust anti-money laundering and know your customer standards like any American financial institution. Our work is further bolstered by a characteristic unique to crypto, the public ledger of transactions within the blockchain, which let us trace illicit funds and track those trying to send or receive to a bad actor or a sanctioned party. In this way, crypto is compliance on steroids. It allows for a new dimension of compliance, public ledgers that enable visibility into what users do on and off our platform. In traditional finance, one bank has no visibility into what their customers do at another bank. However, in crypto, public ledgers provide immediate information about what customers are doing across the entire technology, which creates better investigative tools that can then be used by law enforcement and compliance departments. Case in point, OFAC has sanctioned around 560 crypto addresses in total, but Coinbase has identified more than 8 million through our proactive investigations. By extrapolating out from these ground truth OFAC addresses, we're able to stop the flow of funds to bad actors in real time. While onshore regulated exchanges invest heavily in compliance to stop bad activity, criminals continue to seek out offshore platforms without those same robust anti-money laundering programs and controls. Those offshore entities often play jurisdictional whack-a-mole, attempting to avoid tough anti-money laundering rules and expecting that regulators won't care. The US government should use all of its existing tools to go after these platforms. Many recent enforcement and actions in the crypto anti-money laundering space are good news. Accountability should happen. Additionally, regulating the broader crypto market through the Market Structure and Stablecoin Bill this committee has passed on a bipartisan basis would help create better guidance for the industry and encourage the industry to develop here in America. And while cybersecurity is an issue much bigger than crypto, additional cyber measures and standards would make crypto less vulnerable to cyber attacks. In closing, Coinbase is committed to working with Congress and law enforcement to combat illicit finance and terrorism. Safeguarding our platform is core to our mission of enabling economic freedom in a trusted, secure, and compliant way. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Mr. Redbourn, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hill, Ranking Member Lynch, and members of the subcommittee for holding this hearing and inviting me to participate. It is a true honor to be here today. I am humbled by the critical role this institution plays in protecting our democracy. My name is Ari Redbourn. I am the Global Head of Policy at TRM Labs, a blockchain intelligence company. We provide software and critical threat intelligence data to law enforcement, regulators, national security agencies, financial institutions, and cryptocurrency businesses to investigate and mitigate the risk of fraud and financial crime in cryptocurrencies. I have spent my career working to protect the financial system from illicit actors, first for over a decade at the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia, and then at the U.S. Treasury Department, where I work with teams from OFAC, FinCEN, and across the interagency to safeguard the financial system from illicit actors. During my time at the U.S. Attorney's Office, I appeared almost daily in courtrooms just down the street from here. Each morning, I would walk in and address the court, Ari Redbourn for the United States. Those moments were the proudest of my professional life. I know that I can speak for my fellow witnesses who have all dedicated their lives to the service of this country when I say that we are all here for the United States. We are here to work with you on protecting the financial system from illicit actors, while at the same time ensuring that the U.S. remains the center of technological innovation in the world. As we examine approaches to combating illicit finance in crypto, it is paramount that we discuss and understand how we can leverage the native properties of public blockchains to disrupt it. The native properties of public blockchains, data that is transparent, traceable, and permanent, can enable law enforcement, regulators, and national security officials to more effectively and efficiently detect and investigate financial crime. In my written testimony, I cited examples and provided case studies in which law enforcement leveraged blockchain intelligence in order to investigate scams, hacks, and other illicit activity. And it is not just law enforcement. Over the last few years, Treasury has created a playbook that has effectively leveraged blockchain intelligence to deploy sanctions to target illicit actors, while at the same time using enforcement actions to send a message about the importance of compliance. Treasury's playbook has been effective. Most recently, in November 2023, OFAC sanctioned Bitcoin mixer Sinbad, calling the service, quote, a key money laundering tool of North Korea's OFAC-designated Lazarus Group. Following Treasury's designation of Sinbad, according to TRM, the mixing service essentially shut down operations. In January 2023, Treasury announced an order pursuant to Section 9714A of the Combating Russian Money Laundering Act against non-compliant exchange Bitslato for facilitating ransomware and other illicit activity. That action caused a 99% reduction in incoming volume to Bitslato, essentially shuttering the exchange. Over the last few years, there's been a growing focus by regulators on the use of privacy-enhancing technologies, such as mixers. In a financial system in which more and more transactions occur on open, transparent blockchains, where every transaction is logged and immutable, crypto mixers extend the norm of financial privacy into the realm of cryptocurrencies. However, we have seen illicit actors, such as North Korea, use mixers to launder billions of dollars in hacked and stolen funds. As we craft policy, we must ensure that lawful users are able to transact in a secure and private manner while mitigating the risk from illicit actors. The first line of defense from illicit actors who use mixing technologies is the ability to trace the flow of funds through mixers. TRM works with law enforcement today to enable the ability to trace through many mixers. The issues of security and privacy on blockchains are global in nature. This means that international cooperation, information sharing, and providing the necessary resources to regulators, law enforcement, and national security officials is more important than ever. TRM, working with law enforcement entities, provides essential tools and has trained thousands of agents and investigators across the globe. We look forward to continuing to work with regulators and policymakers globally to provide the tools and training necessary to mitigate risk in the crypto ecosystem. Every morning when I walked into these courtrooms and addressed the court, Ari Redbourn for the United States, I did so knowing that I was part of something greater than myself. I still feel that way every day at TRM as we work to build a safer financial system. I look forward to working with this committee on that mission.
Ms. House, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Hill, Ranking Member Lynch, and distinguished members of the subcommittee for your leadership in holding this hearing and the honor of the invitation to testify. My name is Carol House. I am a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, an executive in residence at TerraNet Ventures, and chair of the CFTC's Technology Advisory Committee. Most of my career has been at the intersection of national security, emerging technologies, and finance. I have served in the U.S. Army, the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, and FinCEN. I also served 2 tours in the White House, including most recently at the National Security Council, where I supported initiatives like the U.S. counter-ransomware strategy and President Biden's executive order on ensuring responsible development of digital assets. Innovation is core to the U.S. economy, but we have learned that responsible innovation does not mean unchecked technological advancement without regard to implications for society, security, and democratic values. Cryptocurrency remains a serious risk for illicit finance. It is not inevitable for the sector to remain that way, but the unique aggregate features of crypto right now, compounded by the existing state of compliance domestically and abroad especially, have cultivated an environment ripe for exploitation by rogue nations and fraudsters. There are mitigating measures like transparency that are helping to combat illicit finance, but critical and timely steps are needed to make best use of them. The status quo has not yielded benefits for consumers, the evolving DeFi ecosystem, or U.S. leadership. Core to cryptocurrency's appeal to both licit and illicit users is its ability to transfer value peer-to-peer, pseudonymously, irreversibly, with global reach and increased speed and cost efficiencies. The absence or reduction of financial intermediaries and central points of control in more highly decentralized cryptocurrency systems also challenges clear lines of responsibility and accountability that are crucial in managing risks in high-value, high-risk activities like finance. A risk mitigating feature of cryptocurrencies is their often public and transparent nature. However, aside from concerns about consumer privacy, there are limitations to this transparency, ranging from off-chain data, as well as the use of obfuscation methods like mixing, chain hopping, and encryption. The same extent of transparency that we see today is also not inevitably a part of these systems in the future, given growing experimentation to integrate privacy-enhancing technologies. With these features and the lagging state of noncompliance in mind, cryptocurrency remains attractive to a full spectrum of illicit actors. It is the favored tool of cybercriminals and the predominant means of payment in sophisticated ransomware-as-a-service economies that target critical infrastructure like energy and hospitals, extorting at least $1 billion last year alone. The Biden administration also reported that North Korea has funded about half of its proliferation regime via cybercrime and cryptocurrency theft. Despicable pig butchering and investment fraud schemes continue to harm consumers, with over $9 billion reported in fraud in 2022. Cryptocurrency is one of a suite of tools used in many forms of transnational organized crime, including drug and human trafficking, as well as terrorism financing and sanctions evasion and offset. There are also national security concerns implicated by diminished leadership in driving responsible financial and technology experimentation here, when adversarial nations have for years been pursuing alternative payment systems and developing building blocks for the next phase of the internet, not to mention homes to the administrators of leading purported US dollar-denominated stablecoins. In light of the threat, policymakers must consider what to do about it. The CFTC TAC recent report on DeFi outlined some opportunities for approaching accountability and addressing these novel issues, such as building in dynamic compliance features at different layers of the DeFi tech stack, as well as considering ongoing infrastructure provider-related regulations developing at DHS and Commerce. Despite calls for equivalent privacy and neutrality treatment of DeFi as we give the internet, I would encourage consideration that financial versus information activity carries different levels of risk. Neutrality is not an acceptable position to take toward illicit finance. I'll offer some opportunities to consider for combating crypto crime. First, enhance regulatory and enforcement agencies' capability to take sustained, timely action against the most egregious violators of our illicit finance framework, such as through prioritized resourcing for agencies and honing disruption authorities like FinCEN's 9714 and 311 designations. Next, promote international action on combating illicit cryptocurrency activity in priority jurisdictions through diplomacy and capacity building. Third, enhance outcome-oriented public-private partnerships for info sharing and R&D. And finally, promote development of secure, trustworthy, and interoperable digital identity infrastructure. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak on this issue. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Before we turn to questions, it's an opportunity for us to hear from our ranking member of the full committee, Mrs. Waters, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. It is ironic that Republicans are holding this hearing on crypto crime while simultaneously working to undermine our national security. Instead of bolstering agencies that crack down on crypto crime, extreme MAGA Republicans are working to cut funding for these agencies and put our national security at risk. Just yesterday, Republicans emphasized they do not want to give FinCEN national resources and authorities, despite requests from Treasury to fill gaps in the law to go after crypto crime. Committee Democrats, however, are working with the Biden administration to ensure that crypto companies fully comply with the law. We're also holding those that are not compliant accountable for breaking clear rules of the road. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Mr. Moser, let's start with you. In every digital asset transaction, there are multiple actors with varying degrees of participation and insight into the specific transaction on the chain. As a former acting director of FinCEN, could you explain why it does not make sense to subject miners and validators to BSA requirements?
Thank you very much, sir, for that question. I think it's a great question. I think it goes to part of what I was discussing before in terms of infrastructure. Miners and validators are essentially producing blocks and verifying blocks, and they're operating like an internet service provider in the internet today. That's not something that we would subject to KYC in the sense that it's just data being processed. And so in the same way for miners and validators, it's essentially a random process of allocation of processing data. And so they're not customers. There is no customer to a validator or a miner. It's mathematical processing. Those are random. They can't select them. And even if any particular validator or miner were to decide, although it doesn't really have a choice in the algorithm, but where they just decide not to process any given block, any other validator anywhere in the world could simply do it. So it just would not be effective.
So meaning that if we were to require them to, a validator or a miner to become a money service business, that wouldn't do anything per se to stop terror financing use of crypto. Is that your testimony?
Yes, sir, it would not be effective. There's no customer.
Right. So what, in your view, would be the most effective way?
Well, we know, and Mr. Redboard can speak more to this, but it's clear in every Treasury risk assessment and every blockchain analytics assessment that the overwhelming majority of illicit finance, to the extent that it's even in crypto, is happening at centralized exchanges where the on-ramp and off-ramping is happening, and almost all of that is happening offshore because of regulatory arbitrage, where other jurisdictions have not been brought up to U.S. standards of transparency.
Right. Mr. Redbourn, you want to comment on that? And comment from the standpoint of the off-ramp, on-ramp connected to a U.S. regulated entity versus an offshore entity, and comment on how the U.S. government and our partners and allies around the country go after offshore entities that are attempting to circumvent that.
Absolutely, yes, sir. And look, when you're thinking about the laundering process, you may see layering and the moving of funds in the decentralized ecosystem. But in this day and age, illicit actors and lawful users still need off-ramps to convert those funds to more usable fiat currencies to buy things. So really, where the money laundering is occurring is on those on and off ramps, and it's a combination of regulation. Look, in the United States today, there is, cryptocurrency exchanges are treated like money service businesses. They have robust compliance controls in place to stop that laundering. And in terms of the vulnerabilities on those offshore exchanges that are non-compliant, that's where we've seen OFAC and the Treasury Department and the Department of Justice successfully target, right? The major designations to date in the cryptocurrency space have been SUEX, ChatX, Garantex, Bitslotto, all non-compliant Russia-related exchanges that were being used to launder funds. So a combination of enforcing compliance and FATF standards globally, and then targeting those non-compliant exchanges is the best way to stop money laundering in the space.
All right. Thank you. Ms. Hill, let me turn to you. The Treasury in their 2024 Terror Financing Risk Assessment explained that terror groups soliciting donations of virtual assets are increasingly turning to stable coins. Do you agree with that based on your experience?
We have seen certain offshore US dollar denominated stablecoins being used by illicit actors. I don't know why illicit actors turn to certain offshore stablecoins, but I believe it's because they have publicly taken a viewpoint that they're above AML-CFT standards. And so we would encourage any US dollar peg stablecoin to have the same regulatory obligations under OFAC and FinCEN so that they're not used by terrorist financing groups, money launderers, the stablecoin of choice. In fact, and I might add, the United Nations just recently put out a report identifying some of these offshore stablecoins.
Thank you.
And so it's not my personal opinion.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mosier, I'd like you to take a question from me on the, and report to me back in writing about the use of special measures to go after this as opposed to sanctions. If you could reflect on that and yield back. Recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. House, in its illicit finance risk assessment of decentralized finance, Treasury found that key factors such as non-compliant DeFi services, disintermediation, a lack of implementation of the international AML-CFT standards, among other factors, pose vulnerabilities that enable criminal use of DeFi services. I'm especially concerned about the opportunity for terrorist financing and other criminal activity that is made possible through the tools that anonymize users of holders of digital assets. The crypto industry claims that crypto makes it easier to catch criminals because it tracks each transaction. Can you discuss whether you agree with this claim and how DeFi services can complicate the matter?
Thank you very much for the question, Congressman. I would say that the public nature of the ledger does make it easier to trace. SWIFT and cash transactions and chips and Fedwire do not publish to public ledgers. However, cash also takes time and space, significant time and space, to move from point A to point B around the world. And the features that we discussed earlier about cryptocurrency, its peer-to-peer nature, pseudonymous nature, its irreversibility, global reach, and increased speed, while those are features that exist in the traditional system, they don't tend to coexist in the same asset all at once. So the enhanced risk profile of crypto is driven by the co-living of all those features in one asset. Transparency is a risk mitigating feature, but like I've mentioned before in my testimony, that is not inevitable. So it's an insightful question to ask that cryptocurrency carries a lot of risky features. It has some risk mitigating ones, but the failed state of compliance, especially internationally by international jurisdictions and many offshore operating exchanges, and even insufficient compliance in US operating ones have enabled its exploitation.
Thank you, Ms. House. So-called on and off ramps are a critical part of our conversations on digital assets and illicit finance. On ramps allow users to exchange their fiat currency, such as US dollars for crypto, and ultimately gaining access to the wider digital assets ecosystem. Off-ramps allow users to exchange their crypto back to traditional currencies. Additionally, we often hear industry advocates call for regulating only the on and off ramps in this space. In your testimony and the report of DeFi, just recently published by CFTC Technology Advisory Committee, you chair, you have stated that focusing on the on and off ramps may not be sufficient to mitigate the risk in this space. Can you elaborate on that for us? What does regulation beyond on and off ramps potentially look like? And what kind of options are available that Congress and policymakers should consider?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for that thoughtful question. I agree that regulation exclusively focused on the on and off ramps is insufficient. Even the FATF considered only focusing on where fiat and crypto were being exchanged and not focusing on crypto-to-crypto exchange mechanisms. That was originally in the EU anti-money laundering directive, but ultimately they had to evolve because they recognized that the risk was happening where crypto can be transferred between other currencies and also moved through decentralized exchanges. So ultimately focusing exclusively on and off ramps is insufficient in the long term, especially as the vision of this space is to move more and more into decentralization. And as you get more acceptance in exchange for goods and services, you can't rely on those on and off ramps anymore. The vision here demands that we have a vision to be able to focus regulation beyond there as the risk profile changes. So in the DeFi report that you mentioned, we highlighted lots of different types of technical features and compliance controls that can be built in at different layers of the ecosystem. That could focus, for example, at the network layer where miners exist. A good place to start might be something like sanctions. OFAC has already stated in their compliance guidance that miners may already have sanction screening obligations. So a good place to start right now before imposing new AML obligations on miners or those who exist at the network layer could be to enforce the existing obligations when they validate transfers going to sanctioned actors like Lazarus Group.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Ohio, the Vice Chairman of the Digital Assets Committee, Mr. Davidson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Chairman. Thank you for hosting this additional hearing on illicit finance in the digital asset space. I think we didn't cover everything in our previous hearing, and for that reason, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record an op-ed titled "Setting the Record Straight and Debunking Unworkable Illicit Finance Proposals."
Without objection.
You know, as we look at this space, Bank Secrecy Act's been around for a long time. There's been a lot of illicit finance. I've never been to Sinaloa, Mexico, but I'm pretty sure there's some illicit finance down there. We have sanctions regimes in place to be able to target known bad actors for all kinds of things, including, in theory, fentanyl or, cartel activity. I'll note there are no financial institutions in Sinaloa, Mexico, sanctioned. So as a percentage of the illicit finance that goes on in the world, it seems digital assets is small, but since this is the Digital Assets Committee, it does seem relevant that we would focus on the amount of illicit activity that does take place here and whether the protocols that we have in place are adequate, how might we update our regulatory framework. Part of that, of course, is we don't have a good regulatory framework for the entire space. We've had lots of hearings on that, but Mr. Rabin, you were a prosecutor at the DOJ for over 10 years. During that time, there was a substantial evolution in how digital assets were used by bad actors and how law enforcement was able to trace, identify, and capture them. Can you walk us through the process, how you used to identify illegal activity in digital assets, and touch on how law enforcement capabilities have evolved to what they are today? I think it highlights the BSA AML framework.
Yes, Congressman, thank you for that question. In the early days of cryptocurrency crime, frankly, law enforcement didn't know how to address it. But very quickly, law enforcement was able to incorporate blockchain analytics into its investigations that essentially flipped the script. So it went from criminals thinking that cryptocurrency was beneficial to them understanding that it actually posed serious dangers to them. Because as soon as us on the law enforcement side could connect that criminal to a single transaction on a blockchain, we potentially then could see the entirety of that person's historical transactions. It was a critical piece of attribution to being able to prosecute someone. After several years of working these types of cases, including running a task force that focused on prosecuting dark web-related activity, it almost was like shooting fish in a barrel, where once we saw they were using a certain transaction related to Bitcoin, they were almost certainly dead to rights. We would then immediately issue a subpoena to any cryptocurrency exchange that was connected with that transaction, and often within 24 hours, we would receive all of the evidence that we needed. Whereas if it was going to a bank account, we would wait weeks, if not months, and then have to use analysts to digest all of that data. In short, it was extremely burdensome and cumbersome to do this in the traditional financial space, as opposed to doing it in the cryptocurrency space.
Thank you for clarifying that. I look forward to hosting an event for local law enforcement because at the federal level, we have a lot of these capabilities, but we don't have these transferred at the state and local level. So I've spoken with some of my county prosecutors, local law enforcement, and they really want to understand these tools better. And I think that'll increase their confidence that they are there, they're effective, and we can use a lot of capabilities to target illicit finance in this space. Mr. Mosier, DeFi presents some unique challenges when it comes to law enforcement's ability to trace, identify, and capture bad actors. Can you share some of the challenges that law enforcement faces when tracking it? And I guess, you recently co-authored a paper proposing a regulatory framework for DeFi and talked through some of the aspects of DeFi that are compatible with existing regulatory standards. Can you provide a summary of where DeFi is compatible with these standards? And sorry, I didn't leave you as much time as that question should require.
No, not at all. No. Thank you for the question, sir. Yeah, I mean, as I spoke through my opening testimony, I mean, in many ways, this blockchains are essentially cyber infrastructure. And so, as Mr. Rabin was explaining the cases that they were prosecuting at Department of Justice, which I prosecuted at Justice as well, and we took enforcement at both OFAC and FinCEN, the ability to have this transparent ledger and to be operating in a digital space with structured data made it possible to build out cases exponentially faster and also to get the alerts out exponentially faster because we could put a name on the list and then TRM Labs would add 40,000 other names and it would quickly get out there. I think our point with the paper on critical infrastructure is that this is cyber infrastructure. We know how to handle this. Put people together like we do with an ISAC, and let's share information because we're all aligned on preventing Lazarus attacks.
Thank you so much. My time's expired, and I yield.
Gentleman's time has in fact expired, and we now turn to the ranking member of the subcommittee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I'm happy all the witnesses are here, and it's a great group. Mr. Rabin, so you're with Coinbase, is that right?
That's correct, Congressman.
And they're probably the largest in the country, right?
That is correct.
Yeah. So what troubles me is, and probably one of the better run platforms that we have, probably among the best. And I know last year we had problems at Coinbase. I know your company was required to pay I think it was $100 million or $50 million fine because your anti-money laundering protocols were not robust enough. And so New York Financial Authority levied a $50 million fine, and then they required you to put in another $50 million to make your anti-money laundering protocols more robust. And what worries me is if a good company is having that challenge, what about those that are offshore and with the global nature of this technology and of the crypto finance system? It makes me worry. When there are gaps among our best-run companies, it's less a reflection on you than it is on the technology itself and how difficult that can be. And that's the challenge up here. This last 2024 money laundering risk assessment that we just got from Treasury, they talk about ransomware and how it is facilitating these ransomware attacks that have doubled from 2022 now to 2023, over $1 billion, and it's affecting a lot of U.S. companies. And they're all relying on this technology, cryptocurrency, and on-ramps and off-ramps to generate ill-gotten gains. They're mostly, as was pointed out in some of your testimony, North Korea, Russia, Iran. But those countries, especially Iran, is very well known as a sponsor of terrorism. So I think the committee is very, very concerned about them using ransomware attacks to get funding, to continue to fund, Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthi rebels, and so it affects U.S. national security. that there are these vulnerabilities in cryptocurrencies. And we're trying to grapple with how to remove those vulnerabilities in a way that will allow us to regulate them and also to make them, well, protect the United States financial system from any vulnerabilities they may be harboring. Ms. House, I know you've got great expertise and experience in this. The idea of an unhosted wallet, a long time ago, we outlawed anonymous bank accounts because of the obvious problems there. Now we've got unhosted wallets that have much of the same characteristics. Could you further discuss specific illicit financing risks stemming from those unhosted wallets?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the question, Congressman. So unhosted wallets are an inherent feature of DeFi, of decentralized finance, where it's self-custodied. So the person is holding it, and not a third-party financial institution. We carry cash around in our pockets. So cash carries a unique type of risk, but there's also ways to detect it, and it's slow and it's heavy to move around. Like we mentioned before, crypto is not slow and heavy to move around. It moves very, very quickly. So the risks presented for DeFi, this absence of intermediaries to implement critical controls against illicit finance, are presented inherently with unhosted wallets. Now, again, there's benefits right now with public ledgers to try to mitigate those risks, but also there's not as much reporting that we're seeing. Like when you get certain amounts of cash that come into the regulated financial system, you get CTR reporting. That's really not happening right now in the DeFi space.
Right. There's another concern that FinCEN has just come out with over these convertible virtual currency mixers. And so we're trying to get at that. What else could we be doing, anticipating that the bad actors seem to be evolving as quickly as our ability to regulate them?
Certainly support FinCEN in finalizing that rulemaking for that designation. FinCEN years ago highlighted that mixers presented extreme money laundering risk, and then the space did not do enough sufficiently to put in place measures and collect information to mitigate those risks. So supporting them and looking to drive greater implementation of KYC across non-compliant mixers and international bodies.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Yields back. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to thank Chairman Hill and Ranking Member Lynch for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for taking time to be here and sharing your expertise with the committee. Senator Elizabeth Warren in December of last year claimed that digital asset firms in the United States are attempting to subvert anti-money laundering and terrorist finance laws. I believe that her claims are, frankly, blatantly false, and I think it is important to remind the public of all the work that your companies do to prevent illicit finance. Mr. Rabin, Coinbase is the largest U.S.-based digital asset trading platform. Would you provide an overview of Coinbase's anti-money laundering compliance program and describe the additional regulatory requirements Coinbase must comply with?
Yes, Congressman, thank you for that question. Coinbase employs over 400 employees who have both government and traditional finance backgrounds in compliance. We have all of the same requirements that other financial institutions must comply with in the United States, which includes having a know your customer program, carrying out a risk analysis of our customers and their ongoing transactions, filing suspicious activity reports, and closing accounts when necessary. In addition to that, unlike traditional financial institutions, we incorporate blockchain analytics directly into our compliance controls. So one thing that we did is we created something called the sanctions interdiction solution. What this means is that when OFAC sanctions an address, we immediately incorporate it into our compliance controls so that our customers cannot send or receive from a sanctioned address. That is something that traditional financial institutions simply cannot do because it's not built into the financial infrastructure of traditional financial firms. So we also incorporate those analytics to be able to determine the risk of any specific transaction, not just if it's sanctioned by OFAC. So we call that know your transaction, so it's KYT on top of KYC.
Thank you, Mr. Rabin. And Ms. Hill, Circle is the largest U.S.-based stablecoin issuer. Would you also provide an overview of Circle's anti-money laundering compliance program and describe the additional regulatory requirements that Circle must comply with?
Sir, I would be happy to, and thank you for the question. A lot of it overlaps with what my colleague at Coinbase said is in his compliance program. We do robust KYC, sanction screening, SAR filing reports. These are all the aspects that a traditional financial firm has as well. Circle is regulated as a money transmitter in 48 states and jurisdictions. We're registered with FinCEN. These are the same type of regulations that PayPal and Venmo also comply with. We also employ blockchain analytics, so we use the ability to look at transactions on chain so that we can see illicit activity that might be using USDC, the stablecoin that we issue, and we're able to work with law enforcement when we see that activity or they alert us to activity as well. One thing that I also think that is unique that I'd like to focus on for a quick second is our ability to freeze USDC on chain. When OFAC announces a sanctions action, we freeze USDC on chain, not only within Circle's customers and our enterprise, but we can freeze it anywhere on chain. That's not possible with fiat in the traditional financial sector. And so that allows us to have greater reach and mitigate some of the illicit finance concerns. Another reason why sanctions are so important in this aspect.
Thank you. And Mr. Redboard, blockchain analytics firms can search blockchain networks and reveal vital information about digital asset transactions, especially as it relates to illicit finance, illicit activity. Would you describe what information blockchain analytics firms can recover about illicit digital asset transactions?
Thank you very much for the question. Absolutely. What we do is we take that raw blockchain data and we layer it with threat intelligence, which allows Coinbase and Circle and others to understand sort of who they're transacting with. Is it a terrorist financier? Is it a ransomware actor? Is it a North Korea actor? To decide how to take action on their platforms. We're working with law enforcement to track and trace the flow of funds. A colleague brought up mixers a moment ago. We're working closely with law enforcement to trace through mixers, to follow funds, to build investigations. When I was a prosecutor, I investigated cases of networks of shell companies and hawalas and high-value art and real estate. There was no TRM to track and trace those flow of funds. What this allows for today is more visibility on financial transactions than we've ever had before, and has really allowed law enforcement to build investigations, to seize back funds, and regulators like Treasury to take sanctions actions.
Thank you. My time has expired, and now the gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. It's certainly true that cyber criminals exploit the anonymity of crypto to commit cyber crimes like ransomware. But it is equally true that law enforcement can exploit the transparency of the blockchain to recover ransoms, as it did in the case of Colonial Pipeline. Unlike fiat currency, which is often untraceable, cryptocurrency is eminently traceable on the blockchain. Law enforcement can monitor the flow of cryptocurrency from one wallet to the next. The essence of financial enforcement is following the money, and the easiest place to follow the money is the blockchain. Suppose the Colonial Pipeline ransom had taken the form of fiat currency rather than cryptocurrency. Do you think it would have been retrieved, Mr. Rabin? Congressman, thank you for the question. The answer is no, based on my experience.
So the question is not whether blockchain is perfectly transparent, right? The question is whether it is more transparent than the traditional alternative. Now, there are those who consider crypto so dangerous that it should not be regulated but effectively banned out of existence, right? There are those who advocate eradicating cryptocurrency in order to eradicate ransomware. The United States struggles with billions of dollars in traditional money laundering. Mr. Rabin, should we eradicate money in order to eradicate money laundering?
No, Congressman, we should not.
Okay. The U.S. struggles with tens of thousands of automobile accidents every year. Should we eradicate the automobile in order to eradicate automobile accidents?
No, that would not make sense.
Okay. So is it fair to say that judging any emerging technology by its worst possible uses will probably lead to poorly conceived public policy?
That's correct, Congressman.
There's a quote from Will Smith who said that racism is not getting worse, it's getting filmed. And I find that distinction to be useful. I'm wondering, is money laundering getting worse, or is it simply getting filmed? Is it simply more visible via the blockchain? In other words, to what extent are we mistaking visibility for frequency? And what is the difference in frequency between crypto money laundering and traditional money laundering?
I think you're exactly right, Congressman. Because of the visibility that the blockchain provides, there has been a lot of attention given to money laundering that takes place in cryptocurrency. But I liken it to the drunk man who looks under the streetlight for his keys. Just because there's light there, that doesn't mean that's where his keys are going to be.
And what's the difference in frequency between crypto money laundering and fiat money laundering?
The estimates are that crypto money laundering is significantly lower than the money laundering that takes place through traditional finance.
Does anyone have statistics on the difference? Or?
I can say the global estimates for traditional finance is that 2 to 5% of global GDP is associated with money laundering, whereas analytics firms typically estimate the amount to be 1% or lower.
Now, Ms. Hill, it seems to me offshore deregulated companies carry the greatest risk of committing cybercrimes. So if Congress were serious about combating cybercrimes, we would create a framework for regulating crypto. Does that sound right to you? Or?
That sounds right, sir.
Okay. And if we were serious about preventing cybercrimes like ransomware, it seems to me we would legislate standards of cybersecurity and cyber hygiene. Right? We should mandate multi-factor authentication. We should not have passwords like SolarWinds 123. But scapegoating crypto offers more instant gratification than promoting cyber hygiene. We know from SolarWinds that foreign adversaries can easily hack into the computer systems of both the federal government and corporate America. And I want to know, how hackable is the blockchain? Has the Bitcoin blockchain ever been hacked into?
Congressman, Bitcoin is the most secure piece of software to have ever been created by humans.
Has the Ethereum blockchain ever been breached?
No.
And as I understand it, a blockchain is not a single computer, it is a network of computers.
That is correct.
And in order to break into a blockchain, you could not merely break into a single computer, you would have to break into thousands of computers that form the blockchain network.
That is correct.
So breaking into thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of computers, that strikes me as difficult, if not impossible.
That is correct.
I'll yield the rest of my time, so I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of the witnesses for being here today. Emerging technology within the digital asset sectors has been the center of much controversy surrounding its use in illicit finance. But today I'd like to highlight the technology's use cases as a law enforcement and national security tool. Mr. Redward, we see reports describing how illicit actors use digital assets or specific digital asset service providers. It's sometimes difficult to distinguish between those reports that are embellished and those that are not. From your perspective, where is TRM Labs seeing the most illicit activity with digital assets? What are the uses that you're seeing most?
Thank you for the question. There just like in the traditional financial system, there are a number of different crimes that involve cryptocurrencies. I don't like the term crypto crime because there's no such thing. Crypto is just the means of value in a number of different crimes, to include hacks by North Korea, to include different types of scams and fraud. But the real difference, the fundamental difference between cryptocurrency is the way we can investigate it. We have tools that allow law enforcement to track and trace the flow of funds on blockchains. And the use of those tools have been very effective. We've seen law enforcement, the FBI, and others seize back millions of dollars in scam and fraud proceeds, money that would never have come back had it been in wire transfers and other types of, in the traditional world. We've seen seize back ransomware funds. So the real distinction here is you're going to see crypto involved in all kinds of different crimes because as it becomes more used by lawful users, that will always be the case. But the fundamental difference is this ability to investigate and seize back funds, which is an only in crypto phenomenon.
So the bond films back in the day, the bearer bonds that they would have enormous amounts of money in a briefcase or cash, I mean, those are traditional metrics of value that have been used by illicit activity, and there's no way to trace that. So this is actually a tool that law enforcement can use that is superior to historic measures of value.
That's correct. For the first time, we talk all about following the money. For the first time, we actually can in real time on blockchains. And the other extraordinary piece is it's immutable. It's forever. So you can go back and investigate cases that are 4 or 5 years old by using those breadcrumbs on blockchains, right? You now have a crime scene that you can investigate in real time and go back to build investigations. Those things never happened before.
So Representative Torres brought up the Colonial Pipeline attack, and it actually substantially affected my district. There was a period of time where I think it was 76% of the gas stations in my district had zero gas. They obviously were able to get the pipeline back on in the nick of time, but I mean, talk about a major disaster for my district that was narrowly averted. So my understanding, Colonial Pipeline paid $5 million in ransom payments in Bitcoin, and the bulk of it was recovered. Could you talk about the mechanism through which the FBI was able to actually recover the Bitcoin that were used for payment?
Absolutely. The FBI essentially is able to use tools like TRM to track and trace the funds. So you can watch where that Bitcoin payment went, and you can then track it and trace it on an immutable public ledger, ultimately to a wallet address that the FBI, using tools, was able to seize back. And the extraordinary piece of that is, had it been in any other currency, any other payment, that would not have been able to be the case.
If the perpetrators of the attack that received the ransom payment had to do it all over again, would they have been able to take steps to avoid the FBI's ability to recover the Bitcoin, or is that something that there's nothing they could have done to avoid that from occurring?
The cat and mouse game that always exists with illicit actors continues to exist today. And perhaps they could have used other types of obfuscation techniques, but the reality is that the tools also, like TRM, are getting much better to track and trace the funds through mixers across different blockchains, across bridges. So the answer is no. The transparency of the blockchain allowed for that recovery, and I would submit, despite other types of obfuscation techniques that they could have used.
So if they immediately, when they received it, immediately sold them to someone else, and that third party had no knowledge that they were stolen, or that they were used for a ransom payment, would that have precluded them from being able to recover them, theoretically?
So if those transactions are occurring on a blockchain, we're able to trace and track the flow of those funds from one wallet address to another wallet address, and ultimately, it would.
But the FBI could not have recovered them from an innocent third party. I mean, they would have to have knowledge that the funds were illicit in order for it to be justifiably taken.
Right. So as I would see it from a national security perspective, they would be tracing and tracking those funds wherever they went. I think ultimately, because you do not want them to go to the bad actor, who ultimately recovered them in the end. Hopefully it would be Colonial Pipeline, but quite frankly, the key there from a national security perspective is to make sure it does not go to the ransomware group.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming here. I want to start just by saying that I'm just in awe and in great appreciation of what a lot of the blockchain analytics firms have done to track illicit crime. As the criminals get smarter, you all get smarter, and I appreciate that as well. At the same time, I'm troubled here that I think we're all saying things in this room that we know are not true. If a police department said, I've been monitoring the crime in front of the police station for the last year and there's been no crime committed, and therefore there's no crime in my community, we'd have some questions, right? We know the crime isn't happening on chain. We had a discussion yesterday that we were talking about this recent National Bureau of Economic Research data that the trading volume for Bitcoin within crypto exchanges before it ever gets to the chain is more than 10 times the volume on the exchange, the volume on the chain. And so I guess, Ms. House, is it theoretically possible that these numbers we're quoting, that was quoted in response to Mr. Torres' conversation, are vastly understating the amount of illicit activity happening with crypto?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. And I think it's extremely probable and very likely that those numbers are significantly underestimating the amount of illicit activity. I concur that blockchain analytics firms have been critical, and law enforcement and regulators rely on them, but the reality is that they're seeing the information that they have access to and that's available on-chain. They're not seeing off-chain activity. They don't know what law enforcement and agencies know. FinCEN had published a very different number back in 2020 with one of their proposed rulemakings, highlighting that they got suspicious activity reporting amounting to about 12% 12% of the crypto market cap, not less than 1%. Now, of course, suspicious activity is not equal to illicit. However, that is also only reporting from compliant U.S. reporting institutions. So that number globally would have been likely quite a lot higher.
Think of it, because one of my views is that bad criminals are dumb. The ones who get away with it are smart, and they're not going to do the crime where it's easy to track the crime. Now, I said at the start, and I genuinely meant, I'm impressed with what the firms have done, because as people have gotten into mixers, we've gotten better at running the analytics, chasing through the mixers. I think you mentioned, Ms. Howe, several of you mentioned about shutting down Tornado Cash, some of the other mixers that have been using, figuring out how that's going. But we are playing this whack-a-mole game, because now we're seeing this surge in cross-chain that's sort of getting around. We've shined the spotlight away from the police station onto some other neighborhoods, and now we're moving into a lot of these chain hopping techniques. Ms. House, can you explain why the bad actors right now are being attracted to use these cross-chain bridges and decentralized exchanges?
You're right that criminals are looking for where they can get away with it. So ultimately, where there is compliance, and I do credit the United States for having the most compliant of the cryptocurrency industries. That does not mean sufficiently compliant, but the most. So ultimately, they're looking for ways that they can further obfuscate their activity, whether it's on-chain, using off-chain mechanisms, and otherwise, the future, I believe, does include privacy-enhancing technologies on these chains, because with the rate of AI developing, it's possible that public attribution becomes essentially open source. And I don't think people will want to publish their activity on a public ledger. So frankly, the vulnerabilities that can exist in the future, not to mention also the issues that you mentioned for obfuscation, are incredible risks that we can address, but we need to take action to do so.
Okay, and Elliptic, blockchain analytics firm, recently said that the blockchain analytics can only trace the flow of funds through a single blockchain without manual intervention. So my understanding, and I appreciate the work that firms like TRM are doing, but my understanding is that it gets harder once you start hopping chains, right? That the actual, Mr. Redboard, if you want to comment on that, what are the challenges to tracking illicit activity once it starts hopping across chains at meaningful scale?
Thank you for the question. We trace the flow of funds across 29 different blockchains and about 70 million different assets today. So we are following the flow of funds across different blockchains, cross-chain swaps, across bridges, on all of those different blockchains.
I'm not saying you can't, but we know that this North Korean hack that I think a number of people have said something like 45% of their military, they got the ransomware, they've got the hack, and now they hop across a different chain, and all of a sudden we've lost them, right? Because last time I checked, we haven't yet shut down the North Koreans and their ability to use these techniques.
And absolutely fair. The speed and scale at which North Korea is attacking the ecosystem is an absolute problem. But the reality is that we are, in fact, tracing and tracking the flow of funds and making it much harder for them to find off-ramps.
Yeah, look, I'm sorry to cut you off because I'm going to get cut on time. I come back to what I said to start. I appreciate what you're trying to do. The criminals are smart, and when we talk about the fact that the global GDP, 2 to 5% of that is illicit finance, we have to stop lying and saying crypto is safer when we know what the bad guys are doing is not what we're talking about here. Illicit finance is a real problem. Let's not pretend it doesn't exist just because the place where we're looking doesn't show up. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Stile, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hill, start with you. For decades, the international community has used the Financial Action Task Force to improve foreign jurisdictions' anti-money laundering standards. Can you touch briefly on how the U.S. should be playing a more active role in improving non-compliant jurisdictions' AML standards?
Absolutely. The FATF, as you noted, has been a leader in establishing standards for AML-CFT in virtual assets. Now the FATF is playing a very challenging role, is ensuring that countries actually implement those standards. And the U.S. has a very active voice at the FATF and should continue to use it, working through the FATF to ensure that the countries of highest risk are targeted, and working bilaterally and multilaterally through other United States tools to ensure that those high-risk countries are targeted.
Thank you. Let me stay on this and shift to you, Mr. Rabin, if I can. Building on the theme of international coordination, I want to ask about law enforcement's approach to some of the novel challenges presented with crypto transactions. How is law enforcement adopting to the speed and technological issues associated with crypto crime, and in particular, international coordination that's needed in that regards?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I would say overall, law enforcement has adapted well to the issues with transnational crime. I would say the issues associated with crypto-facilitated transnational crime are really no different, except, not to be a broken record, they're aided, the investigations are aided by the transparency of the blockchain. But the same issues arise in terms of foreign firms.
But how do we think about the international coordination piece here, right? Because that is, because of the speed and timing, the international coordination aspect is a little bit different, yes?
I would say no because...
Okay.
I would say no.
And why not?
Because the funds still need to be off-ramped, and those go through centralized institutions that are no different than foreign banks.
Helpful. So then when we're going to go and we talk about any scam that occurs, right? So the scary part of any scam is you lose your money. But step two, in that conversation, there's a lot of discussion of if it's cryptocurrency, can you get it back? How are... Somebody's Siri jumped on, I'm not sure what I said. But how should we be looking at the ability to recover funds? Is it different with crypto, or is that just simply a talking point?
It's better with crypto, Congressman, because law enforcement can use analytics to immediately see what institutions those funds are attempting to be off-ramp to, whereas I used to investigate fraud schemes through traditional finance. They would go through a money mule and be in a Nigerian bank before you could issue a subpoena. Whereas,
Ms. Hill, do you agree with that analysis?
I do. As soon as transactions would go to foreign jurisdictions, it became very challenging, even if it was in a friendly country, because you had to work through mutual legal assistance treaties, you had to work with restrictions around what that country could share and what they actually knew from their financial institutions.
So let me stay on this with you, Ms. Hill, then. So as we look at touch points involving dollars, which is a key component of us being able to pull back these funds once they go into crypto, as Mr. Rabin said, right, we have some visibility, and then eventually it's going to go back through a financial institution where we have an ability to capture that. How should we be looking at bad actors' attempts to evade AML obligations using digital assets, and how should we be looking at the touch points that the dollar has in that?
Those centralized touch points, those on and off ramps, are still very important to be regulated. And that is what we see bad actors using to get back to crypto, or to get back to fiat, excuse me. We should also ensure that offshore actors that are either using the dollar as a reference point or using the US financial system or US touch points are captured by US AML CFT standards. They should not be allowed to have no BSA program, no AML program if they're leveraging the US dollar or the US financial system.
Thank you, Mr. Rabin. Do you have anything to add on that?
I think that's 100% correct. That's where the illicit finance risks are currently located in relation to crypto money laundering and illicit finance.
Mr. Moser, do you have...
No, I think it's a really important point that we know that where all the illicit finance risk is happening. This is happening when we were at FinCEN, we were all at Treasury, when we were at Justice. It was consistently offshore jurisdictions that are not implementing money laundering controls, whether it's fiat or cryptocurrency. It's always there. So the wall is blown off of the bank, and to be continually talking about crypto is worrying about the IT guy walking off with the pen. We know where it is.
I agree. I appreciate your guys' comments. I think one of the things we have to continue to focus on is working to continue to improve compliance with non-compliant jurisdictions as it relates to AML. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
We're in a world in which crypto has not become a currency. There are maybe tens of thousands of Bitcoin transactions every day. There are tens of billions of dollars, or tens of billions of transactions involving government-issued currencies every day. So if crypto ever becomes a currency, it's going to be a whole new world. Now, crypto right now is just a collectible. I have a stamp collection. If any of you want to buy it for what I was once told it would be worth, please let me know. It's a collectible. And for a while there, everybody thought it was worth more and more, and that's what may happen to crypto if it doesn't become a currency. Now, a mixer is there for the purpose of helping criminals. Please raise your hand if you will agree that if you would support legislation to make it illegal for Americans to do business with any exchange or other crypto service provider that ever uses a mixer. Let the record show no hands went up. So they're all representing companies who say they want to stop crime, and they're all doing business with and demand the right to keep doing business with those who have mixers for the sole purpose of confounding law enforcement. Now, we are told that there are certain instances where cyber criminals' ransomware has been detected. But that's not the big market. If crypto ever becomes a currency, well, because it has a unique advantage to a big part of the market. And there really aren't that ransomware, human trafficking, that isn't the big dollars in the world economy. The big dollars are in tax evasion. Now, a lot of folks on the other side think tax evasion's a good idea. You know, every time a billionaire cheats on his taxes, a member of the Freedom Caucus earns his wings. But the fact is, you can't be a superpower if you can't enforce your tax laws. I'll ask for a show of hands, can any of you give me even 10 instances where a U.S. tax evader has been caught through crypto investigations? No hands went up. Anybody want to offer me one example? You're all here with examples of catching, you do have one example.
Congressman, I know from my time when I was in the Department of Justice that the tax division had numerous investigations into tax evasion.
Any success?
Tax evasion.
Yes, but not a single public success that you're aware, that you can identify.
I can't now, but we're happy to get back to you on that.
So we're talking about the IRS testifying that $1 trillion is not paid each year, chiefly by the rich. That means they have to conceal $3 trillion every year in income. And yet, while we want to brag about this or that ransomware, we're talking $3 trillion every year in hidden income, and we don't have a single example. Digital wallets identified by Israel's counterterrorism show that Hamas received $41 billion in crypto. Other analytics show that Palestinian Islamic Jihad received $93 million. And I realize that there are fiat currency transactions that fund terrorists. But the crypto world is measured in tens of thousands of transactions. The regular currency, the government currency world, is in tens of billions of transactions. So we've got grossly disproportionate use of crypto for terrorism, for human trafficking, for drug dealing, and of course, for tax evasion. Now, none of you have ever been successful criminals. I think I've got that right. You'll interrupt me if I'm wrong. So you don't know what it takes to be a successful criminal. You're here telling me that the successful criminals don't understand their business when they decide to use crypto. I would venture that since none of you are successful criminals, you're not really in a position to tell us this. What we see is growing ransomware. Ransomware hit $1 billion last year, the highest ever observed. Increasingly, they're using crypto to do it. And they're getting away with it, and they know their business just as you know your business. But let the record show, none of the crypto companies, none of the people here who make money through crypto is willing to stop doing business with the criminal facilitating mixer operations. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Flood, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this hearing is a great opportunity to discuss an issue that's clearly getting a lot of attention. We need to be diligent regarding how digital assets could be used for illicit finance. We want to sanction bad actors in Russia and North Korea that may try to use things like mixers to funnel funds to avoid sanctions. These are definitely worthy issues that I think we need to approach thoughtfully. Let's start with a quick question to straighten out the record. We've heard from some opponents of digital assets that intermediaries in the digital asset industry do not have Bank Secrecy Act obligations. Mr. Rabin, to be entirely clear, does Coinbase, one of the largest digital asset exchanges in the world, have to comply with the Bank Secrecy Act?
Yes, Congressman.
Thank you for the clarification. Let the record show that as a money servicing business, entities like Coinbase already comply with the BSA. Next, I'd like to examine another issue we've heard a good deal about from the other side of the aisle, off-chain transactions. Mr. Mosier, can you describe what an off-chain transaction is?
Thank you for the question, sir. I think there has been some confusion. I'm not aware of anything in the blockchain space called an off-chain transaction. A transaction in the blockchain space is on-chain. That's how it works. So to the extent that we're discussing transactions that are not happening on the blockchain, that is traditional finance. The BSA and all its authorities apply to those. The blockchain is essentially a data transport layer. It's like a car. If someone gets in a car and is transported, gets out of the car and goes and punches someone, that's not an automobile crime, that's a regular crime.
Okay, so in practice, how would a bad actor try to use quote-unquote off-chain transactions to cover their tracks, based on kind of what you've already said here?
I mean, you're not using them. You're enjoying that you're not on the transparent ledger and just committing regular crime.
So when you were at FinCEN, was there a strategy for what some folks think are off-chain transactions? Did you have success in those efforts?
Yes, that is traditional crime, essentially. Right. And so all the traditional authorities apply to that. In fact, that's quite a reason why so many former law enforcement and national security officials are excited about blockchain technology in that it provides that transparency.
I've often said that people who worry about blockchain are not looking at exactly what the technology does. People want to know what the off-ramp is or the on-ramp is. It's absolutely right there. That's the very value of the blockchain. So I appreciate your testimony. I think there remains a framing disconnect on this issue. Digital assets are assets. Most of them, save stablecoins, aren't really an effective store of value. They are not typically used as a currency, despite the implication behind the term quote-unquote cryptocurrency. Could you theoretically barter with a digital asset, trade one for another, and pray that the value doesn't drop when you're making the exchange? Sure, but you would have to do that with any commodity with value, and in the end, you still need to make a transfer to hard currency to effectively monetize the deal that you've made. When we talk about digital assets and illicit finance, the on and off ramps should remain the point of emphasis, as we've just talked about. We need to ensure that we have the tools to catch criminals where they inevitably have to transfer the value of any asset into cash. And I think listening to the testimony today, that's what I've heard from these professionals, and I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Nickel, for 5 minutes.
Thanks so much for our witnesses for being with us today. With any industry, there are both good and bad actors. It's certainly true in the digital asset space. Tether and Binance are the best examples of bad actors in crypto when they aren't using banks or cash to finance their operations in North Korea. Hamas and other terrorist groups rely on unregulated offshore firms like Tether and Binance that have next to no compliance controls. As I've said before, we should extend the reach and jurisdiction of U.S. law enforcement agencies across our borders to enforce our laws more effectively with firms like Tether and Binance. Bad actors. Ms. Hill, first question to you. How can Congress bolster the jurisdiction of U.S. enforcement agencies, allowing them to extend their reach internationally?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. Some of those companies that you just mentioned have U.S. touch points, and I think that the U.S. government should ensure that it's using its authorities when there are those U.S. touch points. If Treasury feels like it doesn't have the authorities, I know that it sent a number of proposals to Congress late last year around expanding their authorities to cover some of those activities. I personally believe that no company should be allowed to reference the US dollar without having those democratic values inside the company, inside their US dollar-backed stablecoin. And so I think if Treasury thinks that it needs additional authorities to go over that, then I think this committee should consider that.
So to those U.S. touch points, U.S. financial services company Cantor Fitzgerald reportedly manages Tether's $72 billion portfolio of Treasury bonds, giving him access to U.S. dollars. Cantor's enabling of terror and illicit activities across the globe is unacceptable. Ms. Hill, given Tether's nexus to the U.S. financial system through Cantor Fitzgerald, does Treasury already have the authority to take action? And what should we be doing about American-regulated companies like Cantor?
I would think that the Treasury Department would have the authority to take action given this U.S. touch point, yes. And I hope that they're looking at this seriously, given Tether's reputation as well as the data that we've seen that they're contributing to terrorist financing and other malign activities.
Thanks so much. There's certainly a misconception that digital asset firms just, we can't prevent bad actors from using crypto for illicit activities because of the anonymity of digital assets. However, that's certainly not the case because of the visibility of a blockchain. Mr. Rabin, to you, given your experience as an assistant U.S. attorney prosecuting the world's largest dark web marketplace, can you explain how law enforcement utilizes blockchain intelligence?
Yes, Congressman. Blockchain evidence is now a critical part of cyber investigations to the extent that criminals are using cryptocurrency to facilitate their crimes. There's a whole host of heuristics that law enforcement use to be able to parse out which transactions represent criminal activity and which ones don't. And then there's a playbook now for what you do with that evidence once you get it, which is you subpoena the on and off ramps, you carry out a traditional cyber investigation to find other data points, other points of attribution, and then you work with international law enforcement to get records with transactions that are going internationally. So there's a set playbook on how to do this at this point.
Thanks so much. Mr. Redbird, to you, can you please discuss TRM's work in blockchain intelligence, given your experience at Treasury as a prosecutor? How can blockchain intelligence be valuable to us in fighting illicit financing with digital assets?
And Mr. Rabin's exactly right. What blockchain intelligence enables us to do is follow the money. And I think something that's often missed is that it is one tool of a large toolbox that any law enforcement has globally. So they're able to follow and track and trace the flow of funds of every transaction on a blockchain. But then they're using other tools that are in that toolbox, subpoenas, search warrants, mutual legal assistance treaties, working across border to ensure that we stop bad actors wherever they are. Blockchain intelligence is the following the money piece of any sort of broader investigation, and we have to continue to focus on those on and off ramps with other tools. When I was a prosecutor, we served a subpoena on a Patriot Act subpoena on a Chinese bank. There are ways to go after bad actors who are laundering through the banking system in ways that we're not using today.
Thanks so much. I'm not going to be able to finish my last question. We'll follow up in writing, but thanks so much. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donald, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Witnesses, thanks everybody for coming in. Mr. Rabin, we're discussing illegal activities through digital assets, or really what the true scope is. Do you have a sense of the scale of digital asset-related crimes as compared to illicit activities using traditional financial methods?
Yes, Congressman. As I said before, the UN's estimates are that 2 to 5% of global GDP is associated with money laundering, which is a tremendously large number. For cryptocurrency, the estimates vary, but most analytics firms say around 1%. Now, there is this discussion about, well, what about the activity happening on off-chain, which Mr. Mosier and I said is a misnomer, and I agree with him. There's no such thing as an off-chain transaction. That's just a traditional financial transaction. So to attribute those transactions to crypto crime is analytically wrong, and I don't think should be done. But on-chain transactions, meaning transactions actually associated with crypto, are around 1% of total activity.
Okay. Mr. Redbird, what statutes or law enforcement tools exist already to help combat digital asset-related illicit finance, and how can we more efficiently utilize them?
Absolutely. From a law enforcement perspective, they're doing just that today. They're using the authorities that they have, money laundering statutes, conspiracy, and other types of laws, and using tools to build investigations. From a regulatory standpoint, we're seeing the U.S. Treasury Department very effectively go after bad actors in the space. First, by using sanctions. So we've seen sanctions against non-compliant exchanges in Russia, in Gaza, in elsewhere. We've seen Treasury target darknet markets like Hydra and mixers like Sinbad and Tornado Cash. So we've seen Treasury use authorities to go after bad actors in the space and those that are facilitating money laundering today. We've seen them use enforcement actions from FinCEN and OFAC to send a message to the broader ecosystem about the importance of compliance. Treasury has tools today and has very effectively leveraged them by targeting the actors as opposed to the activity or the technology. I think it's critical to continue to do that as opposed to look at the activity itself.
Okay. Ms. Hill, since on-chain data is already available to everyone, are additional government-mandated disclosures necessary, or would it be more effective to compile and analyze the already public information that exists?
I think we need to enforce the regulations that are on the books. The Bank Secrecy Act has a number of reporting requirements, including suspicious activity reports, and we also have on-chain data, which, as my fellow panelists and witnesses have talked about, is a critical tool for the private and public sector. But what I would like to emphasize on public traceable on-chain data is that it allows the government and the private sector to track at the same time together. So they can both look at that ledger. It's very distinct from the traditional financial sector, where there's an inherent information asymmetry between banks and government. Banks have information, they report it to government, and then government looks at it after the fact, usually many months after the fact, if not years. With on-chain data, as money is moving, governments and the private sector can look at it together at the same time and communicate about how to seize it, how to trace it, how to deter it.
Okay. Mr. Moiser, with private industry leading the way and already working with law enforcement to track and fight illicit digital asset crimes, what additional regulation do you think might be necessary?
Thank you for that question, sir. As Ms. Hill said, I think what we want to do is first start with what we have, which is very much the authorities. And actually, I was at the Senate banking hearing right after the October 7th attacks in Israel, sitting right behind my former colleague, who was the head of the Financial Intelligence Unit for Israel. She and every single witness there said, the president has right now every authority needed to go after what they need to get after. They're simply not resourced to take the actions. So we should really be doing what we already have and not throwing more shovels at people if they don't have more hands. And right now, sanctions gives us that reach. As Mr. Redboard noted, the Treasury Department has been exceptionally effective in this. So we need to resource the authorities we have first.
Well, and I thank you for that. I would say, for the witnesses, my concern in digital assets is not the bad actions that may occur using digital assets, the tool to execute them. That happens in any part of our financial system. Frankly, it's a part of just life. I think the other concern is, do we use this new technology and do, unfortunately, what Washington tends to do, over-regulate to effectuate an outcome and stifle the industry, frankly, in its infancy? So with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to our witnesses. Just a quick question. Mr. Moser, you referenced repeatedly that our regulators seem to be under-resourced and outgunned. What's the typical salary multiplier when you leave the federal enforcement workforce and go work in the private sector? What's just a typical number? Does your salary go up by 20% or 20,000%? Or, what's the biggest and smallest number you've ever heard of when someone has made that move?
I think I've seen some that you might be going from 150,000 to, if you were to go to probably a senior role at a law firm, it might be 8 times that. 8 times that?
Yeah. Is that sort of in line with the sort of salary gossip you've heard in this area?
Sir, I understand the question and I appreciate it. I don't think that public servants are motivated to serve by money.
I know I have tremendous admiration, but at some point you have a family and you've got to keep a house in the DC area, and it's a big deal, and it's a fight that I've been fighting for a long time, as long as I've been in Congress, to try to get better federal salaries because of the tremendous work they do. Let's see, one of the factors discouraging AML and KYC compliance is simply the cost. It's a major cost for fintech startups. Are there things that we could, let's say, as I recall properly, during COVID, the cost for onboarding one new banking customer was $400 for a typical bank. And so are there things that we could do that would streamline and make more efficient the onboarding of customers and the KYC? I'll start with Ms. Heltz.
Thank you for the wonderful question, Congressman. Yes, so first I'll highlight that at least for cryptocurrency companies and other fintechs that serve as money services businesses, most of their AML requirements are risk-based. So if they do a risk assessment, then their requirements aren't necessarily as onerous or rules-based as banks. That does not mean that it's not still very costly to implement a good program. So I know I mentioned one of my recommendations, and something that you've been pushing for years, sir, is to invest in secure and interoperable digital identity infrastructure, something that can help prevent the massive amount of fraud that is affecting fintechs everywhere, including cryptocurrency. And if we invest in issuing digital verifiable credentials that can help to combat that fraud, improve the KYC process up front, and make it more seamless, and not where companies are having to guess information that the government has authoritative access to.
Mr. Robin, would that be a significant improvement in your KYC AML operations?
Yes, it would, Congressman. And I wholeheartedly agree that it is very costly to run a robust compliance program. I will say the types of regulations that Ms. House and others have been appearing to advocate for would lead to bulk data collection requirements on institutions like us that drain our effective compliance resources and put them towards things that are ineffective. And that's based on inappropriate risk assessments, such as claiming that unhosted wallets pose money laundering risks, focusing on DeFi. Those burdens end up coming to us, and we have to drain our resources on effective things like SAR
I
funds.
guess the thing that Ms. House was referencing was simply the ability to prove you are who you say you are when you want to do so. You know, there's a huge problem everyone's aware of with these deepfake impersonations, and the now famous instance where $25 million was transferred by an employee after attending a Zoom with his boss and all his coworkers. Every person on that Zoom was apparently a deepfake, and it did the transfer and the money's gone. And so that is an emerging threat, and the tool at hand for that is a secure digital ID, and that has to be, is going to be essential, I believe, for just preventing fraud in a wide area. Could you, in the 1 minute left, sort of walk me through, where things are getting lost right now? When the Koreans, North Koreans, they grab your computer, they encrypt your files, and your screen has this message on it. You've been hit by ransomware. You conclude the best thing to do is pay it off. And so you pay it off, and at some point, the North Koreans get to use that for buying supplies for nuclear weapons or missiles. And so where in the chain does it break right now? Just anyone wants to pick it up.
I'll take that one to at least start. It breaks down at the cybersecurity layer. We have to stop these hacks from happening in the first place.
Okay, no, I don't believe you're ever going to stop ransomware. You're screwed. You've decided to pay it off. Then where? And so you go to your Bitcoin ATM. You buy your Bitcoin ATM. You pay it off. You transfer it to the wallet. And then where? How do they run and hide?
Sure, and that's when law enforcement typically gets involved to start to.
But all right. So, but where does it break? It's obviously not working. The Koreans are firing a lot of missiles. Where is it currently breaking? Anyway, if you could, I'm over time here. So, but if you could just come up with, just walk it through from the point that someone, gets some Bitcoin, pays off the ransomware, and then magically it appears in a bank account that the North Koreans use to buy new missile equipment. Where is it currently?
The key there at the end of the day, and I'll just very, very briefly, is to stop their ability to off-ramp those funds. And that's why so much of what we talked about today becomes so important to ensure compliance, to implementation of FATF standards on those points where North Korea can actually off-ramp the funds. Today, we're able to track and trace those funds relatively successfully on blockchains.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witness for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. This hearing is adjourned.